Welcome. Those of you who are here on West 86th Street at the Bard Graduate Center, and those of you elsewhere, whether upstairs in your offices, across the street, or around the world watching us on our streaming, welcome to tonight's final conservation conversation of the year. We've had events discussing the conservation of Native American objects. We've had an evening with our annual pairing of a professor in the humanities with a conservator talking and modeling the relationship between the two that we, with this project of ours here, aspire to. We had an event scheduled on conservation of the home, but we were blizzarded out, and that reappeared as a lunchtime talk only, a monologue as opposed to a dialogue. And we have had, 10 days ago in this very room, a one-day symposium devoted to extreme conservation. So this is our fourth event of the year. In this third year of Cultures of Conservation, a 5-year program generously supported by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, designed to bring scholars in the humanities, especially emerging scholars in the humanities, into contact with conservators and conservation knowledge in the hope of creating the conditions for the next generation of scholars in the humanities to approach questions of material culture with the perspective, the tools, and the knowledge of which conservators, what kind of conservation knowledge they can seek out for the improvement of the quality of their own research and the broadening of the horizons of research in the humanities. At that symposium 10 days ago, we ended up by chance coming up with the idea that there were three different temporalities, three different time zones that conservation knowledge helped us understand better. There was, of course, the moment of creation, conservation as a kind of reenactment, taking us back to the Big Bang in which an object is made. And that's something which has a lot in common with other interesting trends in the humanities nowadays. I'm thinking in particular of the Ways of Making and Knowing initiative of Pamela Smith at Columbia. That's focused on reenactment as a form of understanding creation. There's also a second time, a T2, and this we might think of Marguerite Yourcenar, Time the Mighty Sculptor, the idea that what conservation gives access to is the life history of an object, not how the object was made and when, but how the object lived afterwards through its various permutations, and the way in which, in fact, conservation helps us read the strata of an object's history in ways that otherwise we would not have access to. In some sense, it's picking up the idea that Virginia Woolf narrates for us in To the Lighthouse in Part 2. And then there is, and this emerged just at the end of the symposium last time, there is the idea that conservation actually affords us access to what we might think of as proleptic time, time future. The idea that the conservator, knowing the conditions of an object and knowing how those material constituents of an object will react to certain conditions, can predict, in some sense, what the future life of an object will be. And so we have T3, we have the future. And then we ended 10 days ago with the question of whether this T3 raises the possibility of a politics based on conservation, because once you have some sense of what the consequences of your actions may be, there is the possibility of acting so as to assure or prevent those consequences from coming forward. And I suppose climate science might be the model for this kind of politics of conservation. I say all of this just because it's wonderful when coincidence occurs in your favor. This event was scheduled long before to talk about conservation of the future, and 10 days ago we figured out why this was important. So we have here two wonderful speakers. I have their books here. You may know them, cherish them already. Paul Eggert's book in particular lay, in some sense, really at the foundation of the Cultures of Conservation initiative, since this book, by putting alongside each other heritage conservation, literary conservation, that's to say text editing, and paintings conservation, was instrumental for me in highlighting the philosophical questions that conservation poses, which actually then have implications across a range of issues, not only in a very limited one. And then one couldn't have a better title, Contemporary Theory of Conservation, in terms of understanding the impact of these kinds of questions very broadly. So our two speakers tonight, Salvador Muñoz Viñas, who will speak on mythical thinking in the conservation discourse, and Paul Eggert, the present, the past, and the material object. Salvador Muñoz Viñas is professor in the Universidad Politécnica de Valencia and head of the paper conservation group of the university's Conservation Institute. He has been a paper conservator in the Historical Library of the University in Valencia, a visiting scholar at the Strauss Center for Conservation at Harvard, and is currently visiting professor across the park at NYU, and so it was very easy to bring him here. His research has turned on theories of conservation and technical aspects of paper conservation, author of The Technical Analysis of Renaissance Miniature Paintings, published in 1995, co-authored with Eugene Farrell. Contemporary Theory of Conservation, the book here, 2005. La Restauración del Papel, published in Madrid in 2010, and the Diccionario de Materiales de Restauración, published in Madrid in 2014, with a couple of co-authors. Paul Eggert, who will speak second, is currently the Martin J. Svaglick Chair in Textual Studies in the English Department at Loyola University in Chicago. The book that I showed you, Securing the Past, won the Society for Textual Scholarship's Finneran Award as the best book of editorial theory in 2009-10. His latest thinking on textual conditions is found in Biography of a Book, published by Penn State University Press in 2013. He served as the general editor of the Academy Editions of Australian Literature, 10 volumes, published between 1996 and 2007. And received the Centenary Medal of the Commonwealth of Australia for services to the study of literature in 2003. So it's a pleasure to have both of them here for what will be an interesting evening, no doubt. Each of them will speak for about half an hour, and then we will have a moderated conversation and questions to follow. So the first speaker is Salvador Muñoz Viñas. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay. Hi. Good evening. And I also want to express my gratitude to the Bard for having invited me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here. I'll be to begin with a story. It's not a nice story. Some people here may already know that quite well. Somehow the story starts in September 1939, when the German troops invaded Poland, and thus effectively starting the Second World War. And across the Channel in UK, people were afraid that the German Luftwaffe could, and including, of course, London. So moved from London and taken into different locations. Most of them were taken to different places in Wales, and it was a good decision, because shortly after that, the bombing of London began, and it had terrible consequences the National Gallery, in fact, happened to be heavily damaged. The possibility of a German invasion of Ukraine was a more and more threatening possibility. So in 1941, it was decided that the paintings would be more securely hidden, and they decided to hide them into a mine. The mine was here, also in Wales, in Maynot, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. But anyway, the paintings were taken into a mine. The mine was adapted, and the aisles were enlarged to allow for the paintings to go in. So finally, the paintings were stored there, and they remained there for the rest of the war. And along with the paintings, a number of National Gallery officers went to Maynot, went into the mine, and that included a team of conservators. Here is Helmut Ruhemann. He was the leader of the team of conservators who took care of the paintings during the war. He was a German himself. He left Germany in the early 30s, and well, he had become the leading conservator in the National Gallery shortly before the war. And well, we conservators like to do things, and as soon as the paintings were well settled down, stored, well, the conservators decided to treat some of the paintings. They had time, so they started cleaning some of the masterworks from the National Gallery, and by the end of the war, they had cleaned some 50, maybe 60 masterworks. Now, when the war ended, those paintings were taken back to London, and they were duly exhibited in Trafalgar Square, in the National Gallery, and as soon as they were back in exhibition, back in show, the people, the art lovers in London, and even art lovers from abroad, well, became totally outraged. Those paintings, according to the critics of the conservation, had become much more dull. They had lost any subtleties. The colors looked flat. It's very difficult to get access to those before and a proper before and after picture of these paintings. I have these images that were taken from a book by an American art historian, James Beck, who worked here in New York. And here we can see the detail of Bramantino's Adoration before the war, and this is how it looked after the war. Here you can see, here. See, for instance, this surface. You can see here what has happened. These shadows here, and this subtle shadow here, well, they have disappeared. So now the surface looks really flat. Also, you can hear some, you can see here some dark accents that have disappeared in this photo. So this is the kind of change that made people angry. There is another good example. This one comes from a very well-known painting, the London panel of Paolo Uccello's Battle of San Romano. And well, this is a detail before the war, and this is the same painting after the war. And in fact, it's how it now looks. You can see the difference very clearly. It's pretty easy to spot that the horse here has no nostrils, And well, you can also see around the eye, well, the dark accents, the shadows that gave the idea of a hollow shape have disappeared. Also look at the teeth, the mouth, the tongue. Well, this is the kind of modification that made people angry. Now, well, the interesting thing here is that these criticisms became a matter of a popular matter, and the government was also forced to create a committee in order to determine whether or not the paintings had been damaged. And also the debate entered the scholar field. And many smart, intelligent, good, well-known art historians got involved into this discussion. We can summarize the argument going on between the critics and the defendants of the cleaning of the paintings like this. On one side we have a humanistic side, so to speak. We have the humanistic approach to conservation, and on the other side we have the scientific defendants of the cleanings. The humanistic side accused the defendants, or well, actually accused the conservators of having done very little historical research prior to the cleaning and of producing aesthetically unacceptable results, the results you have seen before, while the conservators and actually the National Gallery itself defended the cleaning by arguing that those treatments had been done by applying a strict chemical control of the process, so that the results were scientifically guaranteed. This means that they were using hard sciences, material sciences, in order to defend, in order to justify, in order to support the appropriateness of a restoration process. On the other side, the humanists, mostly art historians such as Otto Kurz or Ernst Gombrich, would resort to history and even to aesthetics, as we will see. They were advocating for a subjective approach, as opposed to the objective approach of the defendants of the cleaning by Ruhemann and his team. In practical terms, the humanistic approach to cleaning a painting means that it is the conservator who is expected to judge how much varnish must be removed, not just from a painting, but from each point of a painting. So the conservator was expected to decide how much varnish removed from a sky, from a tree, from a mountain, from a portrait. It is the conservator who has to decide whether or not the varnish should be fully or partially removed. On the other side, the scientific approach to conservation, and in particular the scientific approach to cleaning paintings, asks the conservator to remove all the varnish. Make no decisions, just remove the varnish. Make technical decisions, but remove all the varnish. Don't just let your particular set of preferences, your biases, to be the guiding criterion behind the cleaning of the painting. Now, this is an image of a painting. This is a cross-section. This is a typical cross-section. Paintings, well, are apparently a very straightforward thing. Well, they are not. They're very complex. The layers intertwine in different weird ways. They are not flat. They interact in complex manners. both in the physical and in the chemical sense. So very weird things can happen when you mess with a painting surface. And sometimes the paintings, well, are really complex. They may involve not just one paint layer, but many of them. So it's amazing what my colleagues in the painting conservation field can do, how delicately they most often manage to remove the thin, darkened layer of a varnish upon the paint itself without actually touching the paint. They are great at that, and it's well, it's a real feat that they manage to do it so well 99.9% of the times. This is a highly simplified graph of what a painting is. Well, here down in black there is a base. It can be a primed canvas, it can be a primed wooden panel, whatever. And then over here we have a paint or a number of paint layers. A paint is a colored powder glued with something, with some kind of adhesive that we call a binding media. And well, the painter would apply 1, 2, 3, an X number of layers, and when he was happy, he could or could not apply a thin semi-transparent layer of paint. It could be done with the same kind of binding media as the paint themselves, but they usually wanted to have some extra ingredient. Does it make sense? Ingredient added, and it was usually a resin. And with this thin semi-transparent layer, they managed to achieve very subtle, very beautiful effects. They could make a color more saturated, they could darken colors, they could soften edges, they could do wonders. And it's a very important part of the finish of a painting. Glazes can really be very important when it comes to making a paint look in a way or another. After that, varnish was usually applied. A varnish is a transparent layer of some product. Usually, until very recently, most varnishes were made of drying oils or resins. And the problem with those is that with time they tend to age. Now, what can we do in order to remove an aged varnish? An aged varnish can alter dramatically how a painting looks. So it's usually a very important part of the conservation process to remove that darkened layer. And the idea behind cleaning a darkened varnish is very straightforward. We just apply the cleaning agent. It can be a solvent, can be an enzyme, can be a chelating agent, a soap, whatever. It can be very different types of things. So, well, we have that cleaning agent, and then we apply that to the aged varnish, let it do its work, and, well, when we arrive to the glaze, well, then that's it. We stop working, and there it is. We have the painting as it was right when it left. Well, not exactly that, but it's much more similar than it was before with that varnish. It's much more similar to what it looked when it left the easel in the painter's workshop. If we remove all the varnish, then we have objectively cleaned the painting. We have made no value judgment, no aesthetic judgment. So, well, we have objectively cleaned that. Now, according to the critics of those cleanings in the National Gallery during the war, this is what could have happened. Well, we have the aged varnish, the glazes, the paintings, the paint layers, and then we apply the cleaning agent. And what happens is that, well, it's not easy to control. As we have mentioned before, glazes can be made of resins, just as varnishes are. So it could be that the solvent, they use mostly solvents in this case, the solvents could have gone through the varnish layer and into the glazing. So this is what could have happened according to the critics of the cleaning, the cleanings in Wales of those paintings, the cleanings by Helmut Ruhemann. In this case, many people suspected that the paintings had been over-cleaned. This is what critics said. This is, according to them, what happened here when the cleaning agents were applied to the head of the horse. Well, the varnish was actually removed, but they probably also removed some of the upper layers of the paint, some of the most delicate layers in the paint. This is what the critics think that could have happened here. Now, I'm not so much concerned. I'm not so much concerned with the technical stuff here. It is not what really matters in my talk. What really matters in my talk is the discussion that followed, which was one of the most beautiful discussions on conservation that I recall. And most of this discussion, those beautiful, scholarly, amazing, those very beautiful arguments were presented in this magazine, the Bollington magazine, which, as most of you know, is a art history magazine that is still being published. And I will present you some examples of the arguments that were presented in the magazine. For instance, this is one of the arguments. Subjective considerations tend to obscure facts upon which alone fruitful discussion can be based. This is a powerful statement. It's telling us that conservation should be based on facts. We should leave aside any subjective consideration, any value assessment, any preferences. And this is, on the other hand, another argument. It is presumed to be beyond dispute that the aim of those entrusted with the care of paintings is to present them as nearly as possible in the state in which the artist intended them to be seen. Here we have another powerful statement. The statement is, well, conservation should be driven by the artist's intent. It is the intention of a person which should drive our conservation decisions. Conservation decisions should be made according to the intentions of the artist. And yet another argument, the extent to which the artist may have allowed, if at all, for the color of the fresh varnish must remain a matter of speculation. The author here is suggesting us that, well, we cannot really know what the artist intended. The author here is referring to a single aspect, a single technical aspect, and it is the color the varnish could have when it was applied. But the argument can be extended to many other factors around the making of painting. It's saying, well, we don't really know what this person could want. We cannot be sure. So we have three ideas here. They are more or less conflicting. First, we have this idea: subjective considerations tend to obscure facts, and it is only upon facts which a fruitful discussion can be based. And then we have this this conflicting idea, it is beyond dispute that the aim of those entrusted with the care of paintings, that's us, well, that's the conservators, the paintings conservators, is to present them in the state in which the artist intending them to be seen. And the third quote I brought here, the extent to which the artist may have allowed for the fresh color of the color of the fresh varnish must remain a matter of speculation. And here we have these three ideas: facts only, please. Artist intent is the most important consideration, and artist intent is unknowable. This is the kind of arguments that were presented in that cleaning controversy, in the papers published in that magazine, the Burlington magazine, in the early 50s and in the early 60s. Now, the interesting idea here is that these three ideas were written by the same couple of authors. Those three quotes are taken from a single paper. It was written by Neil McLaren and Anthony Werner, and it was published in 1950, and it's one of the most important cornerstones of the cleaning controversy. It's titled Some Factual Observations About Varnishes and Glazes. And not only those conflicting ideas were published in the same paper, some of them were even published in the same paragraph. So, as you can see here, McLaren and Werner are suggesting us to consider only facts. And a few lines below, they're asking us to consider the artist's intent as the most important consideration when making decisions. And this is what I would call mythical thinking. You will have to excuse me. I don't know if mythical or if the adjective is okay, or it should be perhaps mythological. Well, you know what I mean. What I'm trying to convey, the idea I try to convey here is that sometimes thinking in conservation can be somehow twisted by powerful fetish notions that prevent us from thinking clearly. Now, when I use the term myth here, I'm referring to this notion of myth. Myth as a fiction or half-truth, especially one that forms part of an ideology. I would say that conservation has its own set of myths that form our ideology. I would present you with some of the most important myths in the field of conservation as I understand it. One of them is reversibility. Also, we have minimal intervention. We have, of course, artist's intent. We have the idea that the intervention is neutral or can be neutral or can be very, 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 very neutral. And we have the idea of objectivity. Those are, in my view, myths. And we also have the sidekick of objectivity, which is science. So the power of these ideas can blind us when it comes to make reflections on our field. And this is a possible explanation for the blatant contradictions of McLaren and Werner. I would present you another example. This is taken from an Italian author, and they have translated it like this: patina requires a theoretical approach that removes it from the realm of taste and opinion. You can see, the phrase is longer, as it happens in most Latin languages. But this is, you can see, where is my pointer? Here, okay. Patina must be removed from the realm of taste and opinion. And here you have another quote: aesthetic considerations shall always be given precedence when it comes to making conservation decisions. Now we have two clearly conflicting ideas. Aesthetic consideration shall always be given precedence, and the treatment of patina requires a theoretical approach that removes it from the realm of taste. They are clearly opposite ideas, and again, you already know the trick. Well, they were written in the same paper by the same author, and in fact, they were pretty close to each other. Again, we have here conflicting ideas. Aesthetics should always take precedence, always, and here the author urges us to not mess with taste, to to remain far from anything that can be a matter of opinion. This was written by Cesare Brandi, who wrote this theory of conservation that was published in 1963. It's a collection of papers that were written in the 40s and 50s, and he was also involved in the cleaning controversy. He was one of the first authors dealing with it, and of course he was, and he was one of the defendants of the traditional approach to cleaning paintings. He was one of the critics of Helmut Ruhemann. I would say that he could write these conflicting statements so close because he was again thinking in a way that was he was kind of lured by some of those myths we have in conservation, except that he had yet another myth, which is aesthetics, and he was trying to reconcile these two powerful myths: aesthetics, or art, if you so prefer, and objectivity, and that's very difficult. And it is because of this mythical thinking, if I'm correct, that he could write such a weird gathering of ideas. And in fact, the whole theory of his Teoria del Restauro, his masterwork on conservation, is plagued by this kind of contradictions. Now, I want to stress that myths may be a half-truth and may form part of an ideology, but they may be useful. And according to Paul Hachet, he wrote this quite clearly, and this is something that, according to my friends working in the anthropology field, it's pretty well known there in that field. Myths may be lies, but they are necessary lies. With different degrees of success, the myth helps persons to assimilate difficult experiences, or I would say to make difficult conservation decisions. And in fact, beliefs are springboards to actions. It is our beliefs that allow us to make things that otherwise would look like meaningless. So I realize if I look retrospective, I realize that I have been kind of bashing some of these myths. I have done so in a number of publications, in a number of talks I've given before, but I wouldn't say that it's a good idea to get rid of myths. This is a quote. It's in Spanish, and it says, "Contemporary theory of conservation is demythifying, or rather re-mythifying." And I wrote that in 2003, and I was trying to mean that It's not a good idea to get rid of myths unless we have some better myths to replace the older ones. Being a myth is not a bad thing. Myths may be useful, maybe not useful. Myths may lead to to extremely good and extremely bad consequences. The intelligent thing to do is to keep the good myths or replace them with better myths when at all possible. If you ask me, I would say that well, some of the myths that we could be witnessing in the future in the field of conservation are the likes of intersubjectivity or semantic sustainability. We are now starting a paradigm shift in the field of conservation, and I think we are lucky to be a part of it. Just let's make it possible. You people here who are younger than we are who will decide whether or not these myths will be actually useful, or well, we just stick with the older myths. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Before we turn to our next speaker, just to remind those who have been watching this fascinating talk that if you have questions, you can tweet them to us at #BardGradCenterTV, #BardGradCenterTV, and we'll process your questions at the end. That's, I guess, another one of the myths of our time. The second speaker is Paul Eggert.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me here. One of the myths of giving papers in academic institutions is that it's necessary to give a PowerPoint. Now, this evening I'm going to be using another technology. You will all have in front of you just one sheet of paper, and that's all you'll need. The talk is called The Present, the Past, and the Material Object. Published in 1902, the poem that you have in front of you, called The Self-Unseeing, is a deceptively simple one. It was written by a man in his early 60s, Thomas Hardy, famously the author of the novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles. The poem is about returning to his childhood home, a large thatched cottage at Higher Bockhampton in Dorset, in the southwest of England. Hardy's father had been a successful builder locally, but as he worked with his hands, he could not be considered a gentleman. Hardy's mother was determined the son would do better. So in due course, the young Hardy became an architect and worked in London. As a professional, he was therefore a gentleman. This Hardy, the architect, specialised for a while in the restoration of medieval churches. The later Hardy that we know much better, the novelist and poet, ceaselessly returned in imagination and spirit to the scenes of his childhood and young manhood. He breathed deeply of the air of the past. He was at his most alive there, but he refused the tempting consolations of nostalgia and sentimentality. Such would-be familiarity with the past could be a delusion. You'll see this in the poem we're going to look at, where an attempt to bring the past into the present is riddled with paradox. But at first reading, the situation seems simpler than that. I'll now read the Self-Unseeing. Here is the ancient floor, foot-worn and hollowed and thin. Here was the former door where the dead feet walked in. She sat here in her chair, smiling into the fire. He who played stood there, bowing it higher and higher. Childlike, I danced in a dream. Blessings emblazoned that day. Everything glowed with a gleam, yet we were looking away. Well, the sense of place here is wonderfully firm, It's registered with that firm trochaic beat on the opening word, here. Here is the ancient floor. A confident note repeated at the beginning of the third line. Security of place in the old family home prompts the experience of the past. But time is nowhere near as obliging as place. Rather, time shifts, extends, withdraws as the gaze of the visitor poet to his old home wanders across the scene, which becomes both present and past simultaneously. There can be, the poem seems to say, no simple temporal differentiation, since the past is only available in the present. We see the quandary in the very first line. Ancientness is. Here is the ancient floor. When you think about that locution, it's odd. The floor, that is foot-worn and hollowed and thin, is in that condition in the poem's present, and the door is now a former door. But is its formerness in the present or in the past? Well, chronology half falls into place, but not quite, when in the following line it's troubled by this dislocating locution, here was the former door where the dead feet walked in. It's chastening, sobering, almost horrible in it. They were not dead as they walked in, but yet they are now, and the synecdoche, that is the feet standing in for people, is itself dehumanising. So I ask, is there a stoic refusal of connection to the dead happening in the poem? And if so, why? Is it on Hardy's part a necessary emotional defence, a way of steadying himself by coarsening the expression deliberately against an unbidden wave of sentimentality that might otherwise cloud his vision? Despite this instinctive precaution, the emotionally eruptive threat of the past refuses to stay there, and the present courts a return. As we soon see in the next stanza, defended against or not, the past will not be walled in, even if entry to it has to be earned. So in the second stanza, we're granted the simplicity of the ordinary past tense, with the domestic scene of memory now uncomplicatedly in the past. It's a welcome and touching release after the sombreness of the first stanza. She sat here in her chair, smiling into the fire. He who played stood there, bowing it higher and higher. Hardy's father, you see, was an amateur musician. He played at weddings and harvest festivals as part of a village group in a still essentially pre-industrialised Dorset to which the modernising railway system had not reached until Hardy, who was born in 1840, had turned 7. So Hardy's own roots were firmly in that pre-industrial past. He returned repeatedly to it for the subject matter of his novels and poems, and when he gave up architecture in London and returned to live in Dorset, it was in fact to a modern house that he had designed himself. This house had plans and was of the Victorian present. Hardy had already begun, before he went back to Dorset, he'd already begun cultivating antiquarian interests, reading Hutchinson's History and Antiquities of the County of Dorset in the late 1870s. And when he moved back to Dorset permanently in 1883, he joined the local antiquarian club, served on the governing board of the Dorset County Museum, and read systematically through the Dorset County Chronicle starting at 1826. And then in autumn 1888, he undertook a walking tour exploring the countryside where Tess of the D'Urbervilles would be set. Surface detail and local colour would have sufficed for the urban readers of his novel, but Hardy had too great a respect for the truth and its disconcerting paradoxes to take the shortcut. He knew well that the old way of rural living was fast slipping away, but doggedly Hardy would not give in to the allure of nostalgia, to merely subjective yearnings for that past, or to a watery romanticism about the beauties of capital N nature in Dorset. In his living and in his imagination, he was obliged to shuttle continually between a still potent past and the unignorable present. As a young architect, responsible for making decisions about the repair and restoration of medieval church buildings, he would have had in mind the self-conscious historicising that such influential figures as Pugin and Scott and Butterfield and Street imposed in England and Viollet-le-Duc in France. But Hardy was sceptical of its benefits, and in later years he would become scathing of the effects of this movement. He must have lived the modern quandary of the simultaneous retrievability and irretrievability of the past, one that extends down to us today. The poem we are looking at is just a case in small of the general condition to which he was acutely sensitised. So let's finally go back to it one last time. I said the second stanza allows us the blessed simplicity of the past tense, the simple past tense, but that was not quite right. The present continuous tense verbs, smiling, bowing, themselves refuse to remain in the past. At first they seem to reach forward into the present of observation, out of the past, but that illusion of their continuing presence or presentness cannot last. The last stanza pulls back from the intense recollection of that scene to a more generalising description where the past is reluctantly put back in its bottle. Childlike, I danced in a dream. Blessings emblazoned that day. Everything glowed with a gleam, yet we were looking away. Did you hear those end-of-line pauses enacted through their semicolons? Elongating the pause, they refuse the creation of a comforting scene, a consoling flow of recollection, giving us instead a series of sensitised yet almost staccato realisations. The last line, the conclusion, yet we were looking away, is a most sobering retreat into reflection in the present. But the awareness itself, although of the present, is paradoxically of entrapment in the past. Then, in the past, you could have the moment, but could not know its meaning. Or now, in the present, you can know the meaning, but cannot have the moment. It's a double helix of choice, like a sticky flypaper on which we are stuck and cannot break free. The past refuses to remain there. It haunts the present that cannot help but gravitate towards it. This is all within the force field of the human, where pure subjectivity is not good enough, but pure objectivity is not available. We are implicated in the past, it is implicated in us now. That, I take it, is what the poem at its most general is saying. At the end of the day, it is the object or the building or perhaps the landscape which carries you back. In other words, materiality construed in its widest sense, is the lifeline of the past, but it requires agency, human agency, to activate it. There are ways and ways of doing it. There are traps for young players. The mute testimony of objects can be redeemed by our mode of address to them. At its best, conservation is one of those modes. None of them is straightforward or unproblematic. Now, normally we assume that a poem, as an intangible work, may simultaneously take variant forms, versions, without affecting its identity. In fact, this one was originally called in manuscript Unregarding, before Hardy changed the title so felicitously, alliteratively and purposefully to The Self-Unseeing. In contrast, and again traditionally at least, we tend to think that tangible artworks or buildings or objects have a fixed physical identity and that the work is the object. As an architect and church restorer, Hardy knew that they don't, that they are not, that tangible buildings, tangible artworks do not have a fixed physical identity. They don't in practice. So in the poem, he can't help registering the fact as he returns to his childhood home that a door once in this position has since been filled in. As Stuart Brand has eloquently reminded us, no house remains the same. All long-lived buildings yield to the comfort and necessities of their inhabitants. Architectural forms, especially folk forms like the building that Hardy was going back to, are in a slow process of change. Paintings darken with age, are damaged, remounted, repaired, Their earlier versions may be revealed by X-radiography and other means. Identity is thus never fixed, just as Hardy's younger self both is and isn't him now. Tangible and intangible works share this fate. This conclusion that they share this fate is what I now try and draw out. Now, as you know, I'm from the Department of English and I'm a scholarly editor. Put yourself in the scholarly editor's shoes. You are editing, say, a play of Shakespeare's. You find the first textual difference between two variant copies of the same early edition, the same early typesetting, or differences between two early editions, two typesettings. You know your publisher requires you to come up with a single reading text, not multiple ones. And let us say you, as an experienced reader of Shakespeare, prefer one variant reading to the other because, say, it nicely completes the line as a perfect iambic pentameter. You supply the missing syllable so the line will scan. Done. You have judged the textual variance aesthetically according to poetic form. So far, so good. Your problem starts when you strike the second one, and then the third, until somewhat aghast at the Pandora's box you've opened, you find that there are some hundreds of them. Will your aesthetic sense that you have privileged in your first decision hold you in good stead throughout? Unless you are another Dr. Johnson, of course it won't. Is it your taste that the readers have come to the edition to engage with? No. You'll soon be slipping and sliding as you try to justify accepting this variant from the other edition, but not those others on exactly the same page. To avoid this fate, you as an editor bring bibliographic method to bear. You engage in very close study of the type and the flatbed printing of the age and the gathering and binding of sheets. What is odd about the typesetting here in front of you? Why is it cramped here but loose there? Why is the same word spelled in three different ways? Because you lack the original manuscript of the author, you try to detect the sequence of typesetting stints and the habits of spelling of those compositors in this period before English spelling had settled down. To the extent that you can do it, you might be able to discard those typesetters' habits so as to reveal some part of what Shakespeare's original manuscript probably read. But it itself is no longer extant. That's the closest you'll get. You still have to assess the larger changes in wording amongst the early editions and extant copies of individual editions, but in doing so, you appeal continually to the evidence their variant versions reveal of how they went from manuscript to stage to print, and which parties might have affected this passage. By these means and others, bibliography and stage history rationally limit your aesthetic preferences, but you're in no doubt about your aim, which is to approximate as nearly as you can the state of the text as it left the author's hands. Therein lies its identity, you believe, its textual authenticity. Now, the methodology I've just been describing corresponds to the situation up until the 1980s. A single reading text that would most truly present the work was the assumed requirement. Publishers wanted it, general readers wanted it, interpreting literary critics wanted it, so that they could get on with their job more reliably. The work was assumed to be an ideal object hovering behind the early editions. Its text could, in theory at least, be approximated more closely and reliably than before because of the more or less scientific methods you brought to bear on the analysis of the textual variation. But then, in the 1980s, the tide started to shift, not just in editorial theory, but in musicology and archaeological theory, and ultimately building and fine art conservation. Was it obvious any longer that, say, faced with the ruin of a magnificent building like the Parthenon, one would automatically aim, if one were indeed given the chance, to restore it to its original or originating moment? What of its 2,500 years of worship and adaptation and military occupation and other change since then? Was the evidence of those moments to be automatically effaced in favour of the original one? In the literary sphere, was it obvious any longer that the Shakespeare editor should efface rather than preserve and editorially prefer the evidence of those stage practices that had likely led to the alteration in the manuscript sources of those widely variant early editions of Shakespeare's. And why exactly was Shakespeare as author the authenticating source, rather than the contemporaneous stage practice itself? His so-called bad quartos, thought by previous editors to have been, their texts were thought by previous editors to have been cobbled together for sale by actors who'd acted in the plays, actors who were anxious to make a few shillings by cobbling together the text and then selling it to a printer. Those bad quartos had been treated with suspicion as likely to be confusing and misleading. But if these memorial reconstructions were closer to the stagings that the actors had actually appeared in, were they not a better report on that stage practice? Wouldn't it be better to reprint them, errors and all, rather than continue to draw on the good quartos and the famous first folio in an eclectic mixture? You can sense from this summary that the source of authenticity that the editor or conservator might appeal to in making decisions was shifting. So was the nature of the work's identity, which was no longer considered a reflection of some ideal. This was inevitable once the audience or the readership or the viewership was found to be not just relevant to, but actually constitutive of the work. So the Rembrandt painting or the Greek vase or the Shakespeare play was not identical with the object on the wall or in the museum or on stage, or as reported in this particular copy of the first folio. Rather, there was, in each case as well, a transaction, some equivalent of a speech act, perhaps, or a phenomenological realisation of the work on the part of the viewer or the reader. That involvement formed part of the life of the work across time. This was on top of the work's history of early composition, revision and production, and then of the editorial or conservatorial interventions, all of which form part of, as they also informed, that reception history. Works were always already in process. To think of them as a stabilisable product was to misrepresent their conditioned existence. That, in summary, was the breakthrough or breakout that we saw amongst the theorists and the more radical practitioners from the late 1980s, and the ongoing effects of which we've been exploring ever since and still are. Now, this new 1980s realisation echoed Ruskin's in 1849. He had railed against the 19th century vogue of restoring the medieval churches in England, just as Hardy would, in fact. So Ruskin in 1849 wrote, "The word restoration means the most total destruction which a building can suffer. A destruction with false description of the thing destroyed." False description, that is, that it was literally a restoration. No, says Ruskin. He says, "It is impossible as to raise the dead, to restore anything that has ever been great or beautiful in architecture." He goes on, "That spirit, which is given only by the hand and eye of the workman, can never be recalled. Do not then let us talk of restoration. The thing is a lie from beginning to end. Of the buildings," he then went on to declare, "we have no right whatever to touch them. They are not ours. They belong partly to those who built them, and partly to all the generations of mankind who are to follow us. The dead still have their right in them. The walls," he says, "that have long been washed by the passing waves of humanity only gradually acquire their living value," what he called the golden stain of time. To detach the work from its idealist grounding in the absent architect-author is therefore not necessarily to remove the basis of its identity. To think of the building or monument as a work unfolding over time, as Ruskin does there, rather than a static three-dimensional object, is to recognise that its meanings are not fully determined in advance by the architect, the builder. They are also assigned by those who come into contact with the object. So semiotic appeals, therefore, semiotic appeals to meaning will be embedded in the conventions of reading architecture, in the functions of buildings within broader circulating discourses, and they will be assigned variously and they'll change over time. In other words, the building as work does not stay identical with itself. Conservators' new acceptance of the authority of history cast further doubt over the old aesthetic ground for decision-making and the long-standing assumption about the objectivity of the work. These two bedfellows, long in uneasy alliance with one another, were, from the late 1980s, slowly granted their divorce. But there remained, and there still remains, a problem. If the grounds of identity of works are expanded, that is, if every stage of a work's history is to be valued, if every generation's rights in the work are to be respected, if every adaptation of it serves as historical evidence of the work in process, then what ground does the editor-conservator now have for changing anything? 100 years after the restorations Ruskin was protesting about and that Hardy was also unhappy with, those same Victorian additions to the medieval churches now take their place, as Pevsner pointed out in the 50s. They now take their place in the long history of adaptations of those same buildings. They were originally, those Victorian additions and changes to the medieval churches were originally an eruptive response to the building's history, but who would remove them now? So also in literary studies. Scholarly editors realised that the version of D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers that pretty well everyone in the 1970s and 80s read at school or university, 500,000 copies were sold per year in the USA in the 1980s, in fact. That version was actually an abridgment by a gifted publisher's editor, Edward Garnett. The young D.H. Lawrence, grateful the abridgment had been done for him so that the novel could now be published and he could be paid, that was crucial, D.H. Lawrence revised the proofs of the abridgment. Generations of readers who had engaged with it had their right in the abridgment they had read. And, assuming the whole to be Lawrence's, legions of literary critics had written impressive and sensitised essays. Yet surely there should be grounds for restoring the version he originally wrote. So therein lay the dilemma. That's the new dilemma which is still with us today, I'd submit. What firm ground can we appeal to as editors or conservators if we believe in our heart of hearts this thing needs altering? If in our decision making we don't want to be convicted of inconsistency, if we flip-flop as we make our hundreds of decisions about the words and punctuation of the new reading text or about cleaning these passages but not those passages in a darkened or damaged painting, our readers and viewers will be ill-served since they won't know how to read what we have done. Our work will have become illegible. In that book of mine that Peter mentioned, Securing the Past, I argued that we need a more general model of the work, one that will acknowledge what we've learnt since the 1980s, but will coherently afford scope and justification for what we do now. To achieve this, I argued that we first need to distinguish more firmly than the old idealist and objectivist assumptions required us to do between the material form, so to distinguish between the material form and the meanings it acquires, or in the literary context, between the two dimensions of document as opposed to text. Documents and texts are forever locked together. Each one needs the other to secure its linked but different identity. There can be no text without document, but paper and ink don't become for us a document until we begin to raise some meaning from it. They are in a negative dialectical relationship, one which unfolds over time. I'm sorry the going gets a little bit tough here. Once acknowledge the meanings, the textual dimension, as relevant to the editorial purview, then the viewer-reader who realises those meanings becomes ineluctably, unavoidably, equation. The act of conservation is intended to benefit visitors or viewers. It cannot be considered only an act in the service of some ideal conception of the object. I say object, but I really should have said work, for it's the work model, I'm arguing, that matters here. So let me try and explain that a little further. In my own field, I've come to think of scholarly editions as embodied arguments about the question of the literary work being edited. That is to say, editions are arguments in respect of something. They're typically like original manuscripts or early editions which are carrying versions of the work. So editions are arguments in respect of something and aimed at some contemporary audience. The editorial interventions in the texts of those versions are normally done with great pains and within a tradition that renders them legible. They are done for a purpose. A new or altered material object, a new edition, is created and it takes up its place in the long history of the work. We may mistakenly assume stand in some, Olympian position above and outside of the history of the work. It cannot, since it is subject to the same negative dialectic as every other edition. The new edition, aimed at an audience, enables the work to proceed further into the future, only we hope now in a better informed way than before. The peculiar privilege that I think all of us around the table share, whether already in daily practice or potentially in professional practice in the future, is to influence the terms of that transaction, both through alteration of the object or the documents, both through alteration and through explanation. Based on thorough research, a new edition or a new conservation brings new information from the work's history of documentary textual or material textual interchange to bear. The conservator or the editor proposes a new constitution for the work. The proposed argument must be able to withstand the disciplinary tests. Those tests can have, as we all know, sharp edges. Reviewers and commentators soon tell us if we get it wrong, and there is always the chance of a latter-day Ruskin or another James in the corner, already breathing down our necks. When you alter the fine arts or the decorative object, the alteration may not be fully reversible, as we know, even if that is your hope. Historic building conservation is always in that predicament, since the safety and other needs of modern visitors have literally to be built into the conservation. Adjustments may later be made, but there is no real hope of going back to a moment that has passed. So I think of your forms of conservation actually as more heroic than mine. I aim to alter, for the better, the terms and conditions under which the literary work is encountered. I aim to extend its fruitful life by so doing, but at least I will not have altered the original manuscripts or the typescripts or the proofs or the early rare editions upon which I draw, or at least if I have, it'll only be in microscopic ways. This distinction between conservation and scholarly editing must be acknowledged, of course, but it does not alter the fundamental parallel between them. They share a need, I'm arguing, for a model of the work to which both may appeal, justifying their interventions into its material condition. That model needs to acknowledge the ongoing life of the work, which in turn requires an acknowledgement of the role of readers and viewers and even passers-by, as Ruskin says, in it. They realise, in that heavy sense, make real the meanings of the work, and those realisations shift over time. It's into that essentially semiotic process of meaning-making that we may justifiably intervene. So we need a model of the work that embraces semiotics, that is, embraces the idea of works as signs. To understand works as signs, I believe it's to C.S. Peirce's semiotics that conservators and editors can profitably go. This pragmatist philosopher from the late 19th, early 20th centuries got outside the subject-object binary. The meaning of the sign, as he portrayed it, is a developing thing. Semiosis, the process of semiotics, of meaning-making, semiosis is diachronic in his scheme. It occurs across time in his scheme. It's not synchronic, not the effect of a structuralist system, say of language, at any one point in time. The sign functions, according to Peirce, by calling out an interpretant, that is, a meaning that may itself stand as a sign to some later interpretant. Things may take on this relational function of the sign. Thus, semiosis, according to Peirce, must be understood as an unrolling process over time. Now, I won't pursue Peirce's account any further tonight. It's a tricky matter, and he wasn't centrally concerned, as we are, by the relationship, which I call a negative dialectical one, between materiality and its meanings, and he wasn't particularly concerned with the documentary dimension as against the textual, as I am as a scholarly editor. Nevertheless, for our purposes, Peirce's account positions the conservator as an agent in the unrolling semiosis of the material object. What I call the negative dialectic, that is the relation between material object and meaning, is what we adjust by our argued intervention. Necessarily, we participate in the work in this agented way, rather than in an Olympian view from above. Thereby, we take on an ethical obligation to explain what we have done, to leave the viewer in no doubt that what we now offer or present to them is not the so-called work itself. We cannot offer this because there is no such thing. That concept, the work itself, is far too vulnerable to survive our sceptical gaze. But the work in its newly conserved state, or its edited version, can and does survive that gaze. Our professional intervention to create it, therefore, must be legible via one means or another if viewers or readers are to understand what they're looking at or reading and where they stand in relation to it. So finally, what then is the work? Borrowing from Kant, I see the work not as the object itself and not as a transcendent ideal implied by the object, but only as a regulative idea. Under the name of the work, we perform our readings, and then, as privileged professionals, give them material form. We should do this according to a coherent argument and using our highest skills. These arguments are interventions into an existing climate of opinion. They're always that. There is always already an existing concern to preserve the lifeline to the past that material objects afford us. Those material objects exist in our embodied world, and that world feels smaller and has less chronological reach and footing if they are destroyed or damaged. We share this concern with our potential viewers or readers. The addition or the conservation embodies the argument, carries it forth in embodied form into this shared human world. That is why the addition as argument or the conservation as argument always matters. It is also why in ethics attends the acts of conservation and editing. We must be honest about what we do and claim. We may think of ourselves as standing outside the life of the work, but in truth we can't help but edit or conserve within it, take our part in its ongoing life. Thus the conservation or the addition will never escape the context of its performance. They will forever inflect the meanings the material object or document acquires through our interventions. We should not despair at this conclusion. Works have lives. All being well, those lives are the conserved object's passport into the future and ours into the past. That passport is not a constant, for works don't stand still. In his own way, Hardy registered this 100 years ago, and in the simplest and most telling of ways, he embraced the discomforting paradox that we still struggle with today.
Thank you very much. This is one of those times where I'm grateful for the chair's privilege of asking the first question, but I also want to say that we are very fortunate in having with us around the table four eminent conservators, three of whom are here today because they're on the steering committee for this grant. We had our annual meeting, and in a way I'm very keen to hear the professional response of Salvador and then our guest to this. But I want to ask the following question, which may in the general scheme of things be something of a red herring, and the other questions that follow don't have to go in the same direction. But it seems to me that as you set up this argument, Paul, the conservators or editors accepting the history of the object challenges, we call that T2, challenge the stable assessment of the work, T1, right? And that's, in some sense, the mythology that you were talking about is right there in the contradiction between T1 and T2. But the solution to say that we need a new theory of the work could actually be seen as saying that we need not a new theory of the work, right, but of a new theory of the worker, right? Because and if we want to think about Foucault's argument about the author, that's really what this is about. What you're really, the juxtaposition that you've set up is the need to rethink the work, and Foucault does the same thing in terms of rethinking the author as a way of getting out of the same bind. Are we trying to get the author's intention, or are we trying to understand the meaningfulness of the work over time? So I guess what I want to puzzle out, and there are lots of issues here, is whether some part of the problem that both of you are on about has to do with the status of the artist.
Well, Philip?
Well, yeah, yes, definitely. It has. The artist is a privileged individual in the view of the rest of the society, since at least since the Romantic era. Well, I agree that some artists in ancient Greece were privileged, also were very prestige professionals, and also in the Renaissance some artists were allowed to dine with the great duke or the nobleman exceptionally. But it was not until the 18th or maybe 19th century that the artists became such a powerful prestige professional. Now they have this aura. Aura, does it make sense? Mm-hmm. I mean, and I don't know if it's a good idea. I don't know about Foucault view. I tried to read Le Mot in Les Choses, and I quit. Sorry about that. But I could read Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, and that's an idea that I guess it will eventually become a reality. That's the feel I have. The idea that the author is not but a stage in a semiosis process, a stage. It's an important stage, but it is not the only stage to consider. And with the advent of present-day art, I think this is present-day arts involve not just painting, not just autograph. I don't know how to orthograph. You know, Goodman's orthograph works, but mostly art today is mostly something that needs not to have been done manually by a single individual. Most of the works of art, most of the works of art and design we see today have been done by anonymous individuals, and in many cases they are not even tangible things, anything in a screen or in a computer, and that's not really a tangible thing. So the notion of the artist that became so powerful since the Romantic times, and it reached its peak in the 20th century, I think it's going to subside. Is it? Excuse me. As you can see, I'm not a native speaker, so I'm trying to find the word subside. It is okay to go down. Yeah, and this is something that will eventually, that might eventually happen. In my view, it's already happening, and it has an impact in the conservation world. As we can see, some people do believe that conservation aims at enforcing the artist's intent. And if the notion of artist's intent is already is vague by itself, and if the notion of artist becomes less powerful, well, things are going to evolve in that way. Well, they are likely to evolve in that way, but well, it will take decades. You will not see something that we will see tomorrow. But I think it is the way things are. This is the direction in which things are going, in which things are evolving these days. This is my take on that.
Yes, surely, but I'm agreeing with what you're saying. The emphasis on the worker or the author. I guess the changes Salvador has just said since the valuing of creativity as a result of a single originating individual, author, artist, or composer, since the Romantic period, that started to be undone from the late 1960s. You can see it in Foucault's and Barthes and later Derrida's work, and many other philosophers of the time. Right through the 70s and 80s into the 90s. But what was released, in a sense, as authorship began as an originating force, identified with a particular name, as that started to be undone in favour of the circulation of discourses, as Foucault showed, changing slowly over historical periods, as authorship started to be dissolved into notions of circulating discourse. So the originating author became more of perhaps a nodal point, an intersection of those discourses, you might say. Now, I think that movement, though, I think it's faded. Certainly in literary studies, it's faded. There's no doubt. It was fading in the 90s, and from various quarters, people became interested in more empirical explanations. And as those empirical explanations, such as the stylometrics, that is quantitative investigations of authorship, of authorial signatures, a history of the book, that is to say the circulation of printed matter, the reception of works began to be more, started to be less old-fashioned scientific bibliographical and suddenly became cultural, but yet with a material underlay. We started then, I think, to need a new sort of post-Foucauldian explanation of the sorts of things that we still value. I think it's very difficult to find a philosophical underwriting for authorship as such, but you can still empirically still show that there is human agency involved. You can also show that agency operates over time, and so with those two vectors, you can start to generate an explanation of the production of works, and the writing or the creation, the production and the reception of works. So you start to get the basis using agency and time for a kind of articulated backbone of the life of works over time. But what I guess my argument was really still is that you need a model of the work to go along with it. Otherwise, you've still got no grounds for intervention. That the philosophical dilemma is still there. So it seemed to me that that an act of conservation or of editing is always a kind of you sort of propel the thing into the public arena in one way or another by undertaking the conservation or by publishing the edition, and you're always propelling it into, in a pragmatic way, you're propelling it into an already existing climate of opinion, which actually you are trying to change. So you're actually arguing. So it's not just a matter of viewers being us valuing viewers, the meanings that viewers may happen to have. It's actually an active role. You're actually trying to change the conditions and terms of the transaction between viewers and object, or between readers and work, readers and edition. So that's, I get the sense that there's a new moment, and it's coming out of that empirical turn, and that calls out this sort of the need for a new dispensation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm the older paintings conservator here. So what I'm going to respond to Salvador here with some observations and then perhaps opinions. But what I'm going to say may sound rather more defensive than I mean it to be, because I am sufficiently skeptical, I think, to not be defensive. But first of all, for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with the structure of paintings as Salvador and I are, I'd like to clarify a couple of things. First of all, glazes are not universal. Not all artists use glazes, and artists who use glazes don't use them all over every painting. So there are going to be differences there from the model that Salvador presented. Second, the aesthetic argument around the cleaning of paintings revolves not just around the presence or absence or breaking up of glazes, but also around the change that occurs in different parts of the painting over time. Changes in color will occur at different rates. And so as a conservator, as Paul just said, you are now projecting these acts of the object into the present. Those are the kinds of things that you are going to be taking account of in the course of your aesthetic cleaning. But even so, I'm always reminded of what Etienne Gilson said. There are two ways to ruin a picture. One is to restore it, the other is not to restore it. And we will always have that dilemma. And we will always be arguing that dilemma. But one of the things that I think you can at least narrow that argument around is to be familiar with the stances of those who are making a point, who are taking a point of view. I think that the scientific point of view was well represented by Salvador here. But for instance, the use of James Beck and his illustrations. James Beck is a polemicist. And that needs to be noted when you present evidence from James Beck. Similarly, Ernst Gombrich, who was central to the cleaning controversy there in the late 40s, early 50s, he famously formulated in Art and Illusion that artists are forever making and matching. So they make art and they match it to some perceived reality that they may have. I think that may well be worth examining in terms of any critique that Gombrich may have had, say, for the cleaning of the cello. Certainly the clean version does not match reality as well as the unclean version. But you have to understand that making and matching is the premise on which Gombrich views art. And that is a gross oversimplification of a very, very sophisticated argument. But I'm just arguing for understanding all the points of view, both the humanist and the scientist point of view. The last thing that I would raise here is that the myths that Salvador points out, reversibility, artist's intention, neutrality, yes, they are false. They are myths if you take them in the extreme. But I don't think that you would walk into any conservation studio these days and have anybody tell you that they practice reversibility 100%. Cleaning a painting is simply not reversible. You remove something and it is gone. And we all recognize that. Similarly, artist's intention, and I think this is getting at something that Paul was talking about just there at the very end. When conservators talk about artist's intention, we are not talking about the state of mind of artists. We actually have a very complete statement of intention in front of us. It's called the work of art. And there are a series of choices and all the way along that the artist has made that we can begin to unpack to see what those intentions around that object were at that time. So I think that it's very useful to start to take this argument and unpack it and see it for where it is right now in this moment, which is not quite as extreme and as I think given the time constraints Salvador made it. So I'll stop. My filibuster there.
Do you want to respond? No, well, I mostly agree with everything. What I presented is a simplification of how painting is. Of course, paints are very complex matters, and they are not just a set of rectangles on top of each other, and about reversibility, that's a myth. That I would say that reversibility is probably no longer a myth, because it has been exposed as such. I mean, when a myth becomes exposed as such, well, it is substituted, it is replaced by other myths usually, or just left aside. Reversibility, if you have, well, I didn't expect you to look at that slide closely, but of those 5 myths I presented there, I said, I've been discussing some of them. The one myth I have not discussed at any moment is reversibility, because I take that for granted. I mean, I assume that everyone realizes that nowadays almost everyone realizes that reversibility is just a myth. It cannot be achieved.
If I could just interrupt for a moment, but reversibility is still a very, very useful concept.
Of course it is.
Yes.
Of course it is. Those myths are useful, and it is because we aim at them that conservation has evolved so much and so well in the last decades. They are useful, and except that I think that nowadays it's my suspicion that we are moving slowly away from those myths, those luring myths, and towards a different set of myths. This is my opinion. I think it will take decades for that to happen, but we will eventually slowly see a different set of myths behind conservation. I'm too old to probably to. It will take a strong, a huge effort for me to adapt to that. I don't think if I will ever adapt to that. But younger people will probably be more well prepared to cope with that. And of course, I don't try to suggest that we should not be fooled by myths in any way. No, we need them. We do need them. We need them in conservation, but in nearly every other field we can think of. Even in some material sciences, some myths are still useful. But well, that's pretty complex. About the artist's intent, well, I mean, since I don't recall that. Who was this author who wrote the intention, that beautiful text in the middle 20th century, the intentional fallacy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, Besley and Windsor. Okay, so since then, well, then we have had a beautiful philosophical discussion around this topic, and then we had it applied into the field of conservation by Kuhn, who wrote this article in the journal, in the JAIC, and still many people find it useful, including myself, find it a useful notion, except that the more you read, the more you realize that, well, it may be not as solid as it seems. And well, conservators, we are becoming more and more well prepared, especially young conservators, and we have the experience, they have the preparation. So, well, in a way, I think that this notion will eventually evolve. This is nothing new in many fields. We are moving away from the object, or from the creator of the object, and into the receiver. I think there is a whole theory of reception going around, which I don't really know about, but I think conservation will move in that general direction. Well, this is my opinion, but we will see that. I hope I will live enough to find out.
Did you want me to?
If you want to.
Well, Wimsett and Beardley did come up. Yeah, the idea of the intentional fallacy was very strong in literary criticism, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s. What it tended to do was to remove the author's biography or any other external context from consideration. The poem, let's think of a poem rather than a diffuse novel, the poem became a sort of verbal icon. It was self-sufficient, it was effectively objective. Close reading could be brought to bear upon it without worrying about any of the biographical or other contexts in which the poem lived. So the poem lived in the moment now, just as it always had done. And that went along with terms from the Frankfurt School, like the desire for concrete particularity. You know, the poem was concrete; it was an object in your terms, you know, in the terms that you bring forward in your book. And so that close reading became a way of accommodating your subjective response to this thing. And so that the classroom in a classroom, the business was to come to a common understanding, the common pursuit of true judgment, as F.R. Leavis called it, in relation to this poem. But so where that left editors in a particular quandary, because what was their job then? If the poem already existed in essence, why were they fooling around with it at all? Of course, there was an ongoing tension between editors and literary critics, between, as we called it, scholarship and criticism, and that was typical of the period just before the Second World War, and really ever since. And it's only been in these recent years, with this shift of interest to materiality, that suddenly what editors are doing is kind of relevant to the central discussion again. So editors sometimes differentiate, though, between an intention to mean, which would be perhaps the subject of that intentional fallacy, because an author will tell you what the novel or the poem is supposed to mean, but it may not mean that to you as you read it. So editors will distinguish between an intention to mean and an intention to do. That is, to inscribe this sequence of words in punctuation rather than that. And that intention to do might be closer to the sort of intention that you're talking about when you say that the work is a statement of intention. But I would have thought it's not a statement of intention, it's a realisation of intention.
Well,
or a failed realisation of intention, but...
Well, I don't want to dominate this. Others should ask questions.
Yeah. Sure.
Others? You've been called upon.
I have a practical question. Let's say that we find a palimpsest from the 12th century, and there is a an illuminated biblical story as of the original, and on the top of that there is an exegesis that we have never heard before. Which one would you keep?
Both. You let technology solve the problem.
But you're destroyed, but you want to see either one of them?
Oh, you mean one is, it's a palimpsest and one
Yes.
is literally written over the other? Well, normally you can decode both. It should be possible to transcribe both the underlayer and the top layer. It won't always be, you won't get it 100% correct perhaps.
But it isn't the same. You have to keep one of them.
Oh, well, you mean the object itself?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, no, I wouldn't.
Which one would you preserve?
No, but I mean, in a way, these answers about the way in which both can coexist may be true for palimpsests, but archaeology has been dealing with this since its inception, because archaeology, in getting to one layer, must destroy all of the layers on top, and even documentation, which is the more conventional scientific practice nowadays, does not preserve, right? And it cannot never preserve in situ. So that is the palimpsest, the physical remains of the past, palimpsested in the ground, and the decision is usually made to destroy based on what it is that the scientists doing the work seek to find. So that really would be your example, I think. Other questions? Glenn?
Interesting you brought up a medieval example. I'm thinking about contemporary art and how contemporary art production and probably literary production as well is forcing a lot of these issues. Issues of, as you mentioned, changing our myths, conservation, questions of authorship. And for those of us who are conserving contemporary art, we're forced to confront artists very directly, ask for their intentions in an interview. We're also forced to think about multiple authorship and the rebirth of an object through a series of iterations and multiplicity of a work existing in different times or even at the same time in very different conceptions. So I'm just, well, that's just a comment that I think it's very interesting that I think we're being forced by contemporary art production, and those of us working in that field, and certainly other areas of conservation as well. Ethnographic conservation is another area. So I'm wondering about this idea of multiple authorship and multiplicity of the work being able to live at the same time, and a new recognition that a work can exist in multiple forms with multiple understandings. It's not necessarily the author is forced to die in order for the rebirth of an object through a person's experience of it, but maybe it stays alive and another work is born to coexist.
Well, actually, what I was about to say is sparked by one of Salvador's articles in relation to conceptual art and to art that involves movement of the object, kinetic art, where necessarily there can be no single stabilisable thing. With conceptual art, I think that bears most closely on your question, because it occurred to me in reading your article actually that conceptual art and what I do are actually not all that far apart, you know. And what I do as a scholarly editor is to pay very close attention to versions. So we postulate the notion of the work, we postulate the notion of a version, which fits within this regulative idea of the work. So there can be multiple versions, but a version is still not the same thing as the document. The document to an editor may have various errors in it, which need amending. So you still need to establish a text of a version in the same way that you do, or you may argue that you do of a work. So with conceptual art, I'm thinking or performance art for that matter, I suppose, that every performance event of the same work is going to be different. It's going to be a little bit like the stage history of Shakespeare's plays. You know, depending on how many actors were available, you just change. You just change it, or cut lines or add lines, depending on who was, what could be done on the night. So performance art is not all that far away from that situation, and conceptual art where there is an idea, and I presume normally a statement of the idea. So there is a record, there's a recording of the conceptual art of some kind. That's where I think the parallel is.
Exactly, and that's the kind of art that I'm thinking of, or installation art, where the work is de-installed and the objects are thrown away, and then it's reconstituted the next time it's installed.
Yeah.
So the work doesn't exist except as an idea or as a set of instructions, and through its documentation as, you know, in video or artist interviews, artist statements. It exists in many fragments in different ways. And I'm actually borrowing a lot of my thinking from Hannah Pulling's work, an argument that the work then lives in the archive. And the best way to know the work is through understanding of its multiple iterations and through fragments of documentation.
Yeah. And that's effectively where digital scholarly editing is going. But we distinguish between, we're beginning to distinguish anyway, between the digital archive and the edition, which is, as I said before, a kind of argument about the contents of the archive. But it's in the archive that you get the evidence, the documentation, the facsimile images, the transcriptions, the commentary.
On that note of rebirth, having come to the end of our 2 hours, I want to thank speakers, I want to thank the questions, all of you in the audience for being part of, I think, a very, very stimulating evening with questions that will, I think, kick around in our heads for some time to come. So let's thank our speakers.